The Barrens of Kalimdor have always teemed with life. Tough and hardy, but life all the same. Yet nestled deep within its southern mountain ranges, growing darkness can be found within the Razorfen Downs, a creeping and insidious shadow that threatens to upend the cycle of life and death on which these lands and its inhabitants depend. My name is Shuppzy, and today in Warcraft Space and Story, we'll be effectively continuing on from the Razorfen Kraal video, where we saw how the environment and lore came together to show us the dawn of a new culture, and here we'll see its dark mirror, the fledgling society of the Quillbore, being twisted and manipulated by external forces. I've talked before about how impactful the original Barrens was on anyone who ever had the questionable joy of questing through it. A truly massive zone with level range to match that took in wide-eyed newcomers and spat them out not quite seasoned veterans, but players who understood the game and how it worked. So returning again to the Barrens in the high level 30s or early 40s would have been a sort of homecoming, and cleverly Blizzard capitalised on that fondness to introduce the Kalimdor races, the Orcs, Trolls, Tauren and Night Elves, into the Greater Scourge storyline, effectively saying, hey, remember those hours spent jumping up mountains and looking out onto the rolling sun-bleached savannah below? Yeah, that's all going to be turned into an undead hellscape if you don't stop this. Which is kind of genius, because if you'd avoided the Eastern Kingdoms, then prior to this you'd have basically no reason to care about the Scourge. As we make our way down this winding road towards the Instance, you may have noticed the sky and thus everything else has darkened. It didn't suddenly become nighttime, that's just what happens as you approach the dungeon. Messing with the environmental lighting like this is a fairly cheap trick, but an effective one design-wise, because everything about the aesthetics of the Barrens is meant to bathe in the sun. So enforcing darkness here, especially with the closed-in restrictive feel of the thorn canopy, instantly twigs a feeling of unnaturalness and unease. It just goes to show that sometimes the simplest changes can do so much. The dungeon entrance itself is obscured by this wall of thorns, and as we round the corner and get closer to it, seemingly random bits of wood, hide and bone begin to form a shape, that of a boar's head, or more specifically, skull. And honestly, I love everything about this reveal here. It's obviously on theme and in fact is story relevant, as we'll get to in a second, but what I really like is that it relies on that quality that many real natural landmarks have, where it only takes shape or looks like the thing it's meant to from a particular distance or vantage point. So lore-wise, this is most likely the skull of the boar wild god Agamagan, whose blood was said to cause these massive vines to sprout throughout the Barrens. And as the chief deity of the Quillbore, it only makes sense we delve into his resting place, following the trail of many dozens of his people, judging by these prints in the ground, to discover the taint at the heart of their culture. I don't really talk about music enough in this series, considering how important it is in really selling a theme. One of the best examples of that is here, right as we enter the dungeon. Immediately the music shifts from the tribal drums and flutes of the Barrens to the more ambient droning, wailing and whispers of the Scourge soundtrack, which really serves to communicate who's in charge here. The dungeon also immediately presents us with two paths forward, one highlighted by a single torch with an eerie purple glow, and the other with a giant fire-breathing dragon. And I know it goes against every instinct, but we need to ignore the dragon for a little bit. The path layout here in Razorfen Downs actually makes a circuit, so in its original form, whether you go to the left, the more traditional way, or to the right towards the last boss first, you can do the dungeon end to end with very little backtracking, which is quite impressive, especially for a vanilla dungeon. Now as to our big lizard friend, she is Koristraza, a red dragon who was added in Cataclysm and then updated again in Warlords. Red dragons are the guardians of life, so it makes sense for one to be here trying to stop the undead corrupting the area. She's of course a quest giver, but actually moves through the dungeon with you as well, especially towards the end, aiding the adventurers and tying the place into the world and its events outside. I said before you could choose which path to take in the original dungeon. Nowadays though, not so much. There seems to have been a trade-off of player agency for narrative consistency in the revamp. So with our path chosen, one way or another, we round this corner, and as we do, some sort of ritual comes into sight. Spirits swirl around and shadowy lightning bursts forth from the hands of the caster, who as we get closer we see is a horrifically decayed undead Quillbore, and amazingly, not a boss. Quite the introduction for a normal mob, but still worth talking about. The Death's Head cult were found in the original form of Razorfen Kraal, and they used mostly shadow and spirit magics, but it seems to have been a natural part of the tribal society, like the witch doctors and shadow hunters are for the trolls. But by the time we get to Razorfen Downs, we see that the Scourge influence has twisted the cult and taught them powerful magic and unholy rituals at the cost of quite literally their lives. A short tunnel leads us to this massive stone idol, presumably of some incarnation or form of a Garmagan. What's interesting is that we've never seen this level of craftsmanship from the Quillbore before, so either this is a holy site they've put more effort into than anything else they've ever made, or it's some sort of gift from the Scourge to twist the Quillbore by perverting their culture. And it's not just an idol or statue. A now removed quest given by an NPC named Belnestraz tells us this is actually an oven in which abductees from around the Barrens are cooked in and then consumed, which is really dark but fits in well with where the Quillbore are at in terms of a society and culture. If you look at early real-world societies, human sacrifice, and in some cases ritual cannibalism, can be found in a great many of them. Also quickly, for those who noticed that NPC's name from before, Belnestraz was the original Red Dragon representative in RFD, who you rescued a little further ahead in the dungeon and escorted here to deactivate the idol, summoning waves of enemies and a mini-boss named Plaguemore the Rotting. He remained in a human disguise throughout the entire quest, but seeing a dragon was a much rarer thing in vanilla in general, so that acted as a great little nod for the lore savvy. As we continue through the winding paths, the number and size of these spider enemies we face increases, and these massive series of webs running along the vines appear, indicating a change in space and theme. These webs are actually an addition to the dungeon in the Warlord's revamp, and in my opinion are quite welcome as they add some variety to the pattern of tunnel room that makes up the first section of the dungeon. The next path we go through closes in a bit more, with some large vines and low-hanging webs obscuring our vision ahead, and as they clear out, our first boss, Arux, the Plagued Nightmare, comes into view. Unlike most bosses, however, Arux seems pretty happy to ignore us and hang out on the roof. Conveniently, there's a giant gong here to bring him down. The gong was originally used to summon Tutankhamun, who the Dungeon Journal tells us was a blind Nerubian commander that was very sensitive to sound and vibration. So it seems sort of mean they put a gong in his room, or whatever. So Arux, unlike Tutankhamun, is just a beast, created as an experiment by the Quillbore arachnomancers, which makes a good example of the subtle differences in story between the original and the revamp. In vanilla, the Scourge were trying to use Razorfen Downs as a foothold to take over Kalimdor, and so they sent commanders and powerful figures to pave the way. By the time of Warlords, the Scourge are fractured and trying to hold on to and guard whatever power they can. Arux's death clears the path ahead, and it's a strangely empty section of the dungeon that leads us to this fork in the road. There's not really any design tricks or anything fancy here to guide the players one way or another, beyond the desire to see what's on the other side of that bridge. In the original form at least though, there was something more compelling to pull players this way than all the environmental tricks in the world, a quest marker, specifically the one to begin the Belnestraz escort I mentioned earlier. So this room of the dungeon, filled with caged corpses and feasting ghouls, is known as the Murder Pens. I wonder why? Sarcasm aside, from up here we can now see across the bridge, and the sight that greets us on the other side is unusual to say the least. The giant pile of bones and dozens of skeletons are on theme for the dungeon certainly, but why they're all rocking out and the music suddenly shifts to something that would be fitting from a demented ice cream van is beyond me. But hey, it's cool, unusual, and certainly breaks up the flow of the dungeon. And it's atop the pile of bones we find our next boss, Mordresh Fireeye, who as the Dungeon Journal tells us was once an orc shaman, specialising in fire magic and leading soldiers into a frenzy. Which seems like an attempt to justify the inexplicable skeleton rock concert, but doesn't really answer anything, and now makes me want to have Shaman casting Bloodlust via guitar solo. From the bone pile, we're invited to drop down onto the other path from earlier and continue on to the final section of the dungeon, which is the Spiral of Thorns. The change in space here is quite gradual. At first it's just a few slimes and an increase in the number of discarded bones, then the vines become larger and more concentrated, twisting in and out of each other, and the space slowly takes shape as a spiraling upwards ascent. So going around a central point of interest like this, especially when you're going up and can't really see what's ahead of you, is a great way of motivating players to move through a space. You're always making progress towards your goal, but you can't quite get it in sight, and that makes you want it more. And it's at some point, patrolling the lowest level of the spiral, we find Mushlump, effectively gatekeeping the final act of the dungeon. So Mushlump and his predecessor boss Glutton are both abominations created to guard the Razorfen Downs. While Mushlump was the clever but unrefined work of the Quillbore necromancer Deathspeaker Blackthorn, the guy who took over the area after the Scourge's initial defeat, Glutton was essentially a recycling of the parts of an even bigger abomination named Tartek the Enraged, who was instrumental in the undead's initial subjugation of the Quillbore, by slaughtering them in the hundreds, of course. Shortly after Mushlump, we pass through this little collapsed barrier to join up with the other paths from the start of the instance, and also find Koristraza waiting for us, ready to take the battle to Blackthorn and stop him from resurrecting Amnanar the Coldbringer. Even though she doesn't do much, just throwing down some healing circles every so often, there's something never not cool about fighting alongside a dragon. In terms of space, this area is much more populated than basically anything else we've seen in the dungeon, with a lot of tents and huts that presumably belong to some of the higher ranking members of the various Quillbore faiths, prior to the arrival of the Scourge of course. Now however, there's a mismatch of Geists, ghouls, frost spirits, undead Quillbore and even Vrykul skeletons that looks less like the organised skeleton and ghost army of the original dungeon, and more like someone's just gathered together every kind of undead they could possibly hold power over. And so eventually we round the last corner and reach the plateau of the Spiral of Thorns, the very centre of the Quillbore's holiest site, and where we find the next boss, Deathspeaker Blackthorn, mid-ritual. Earlier I called Blackthorn a necromancer, and that's true. He did personally create Mushlump and put Mordresh Fireeye's spirit back into his body, but interestingly enough he's equipped and armoured as a warrior Quillbore, not one of the mystics typical of their cults, which might explain how he was able to avoid the first group of adventurers to tear their way through here. Also, unlike the other Quillbore in the area, Blackthorn is still living, and in fact, as he dies, he's able to complete the ritual to resurrect Amnanar the Coldbringer from his phylactery. Amnanar, as I mentioned earlier, is a lich, an incredibly powerful form of undead that bind their spirits to and can resurrect from phylacteries, which make them near impossible to keep permanently dead. He acts as the final boss of both versions of Razorfen Downs, and the Dungeon Journal tells us that he was the lich that participated in the Battle of Mount Hyjal at the end of Warcraft 3, and was afterwards instructed personally by the Lich King to stay and basically set up shop in Kalimdor, which he chose to do by infiltrating the Quillbore and promising them the power to drive out the Orcs, Tauren and other groups they see as invaders. It's his influence that drew the attention of the Red Dragonflight as part of their mission to contain the Scourge, and it's with his death that we close the story of the Razorfen Downs. Koristraza comes down to take the phylactery into the safekeeping of the Dragonflight, and in doing so, breaks the Scourge influence on the Quillbore and the festering darkness in the Barrens. I've been Shuppzy, and that was the story of the space and how the space has told a story in Razorfen Downs. If you like the video and want me to know about it, the like button is right there, and it honestly does mean a lot. Feel free with any feedback or discussion in the comments. I love getting into that sort of stuff, and sharing this video and this series would be massively appreciated. For those subscribed or considering it, I've got a plan and self-imposed challenge to have pretty much all the vanilla dungeons done by the release of WoW Classic, sometime in the middle of the year I believe. So there will be more content coming soon, especially now that I've gotten a hold of some means of making production and uploading significantly easier, which were a massive hassle before. And the only thing left to say is, as always, thank you for your time.